The story I am about to tell is not some fabricated tale meant to entertain. It is real. It was passed down to me by my mother, a woman whose life was carved from suffering and resilience. Believe it or not, that is up to you. But by the end of this story, you will see her for what she truly was, a warrior. This took place in the 1980s, in New York. My mother, who was 22 at the time, was pregnant with me. The man responsible for my existence abandoned her the moment he found out. He vanished into the night like a coward, leaving her utterly alone. But she had always been alone. She never knew her parents, never had siblings. She was found as an infant, abandoned in a park, left to the mercy of strangers. A group of scouts stumbled upon her and took her to an orphanage, where she spent her childhood and teenage years. The moment she became an adult, she was released into the world, forced to build her life from nothing. She found work as a waitress in a grimy little bar, probably the same place where she met the man who became my father. But she never spoke of him. I never asked. Some ghosts should remain buried. Then I was born, and her life became even more brutal. She could have left me at a hospital, dumped me on a stranger's doorstep, or worse. But she chose to keep me. With no family to rely on, no safety net, she carried me with her everywhere. A newborn baby, clinging to her like a curse. She was my mother, my protector, my entire world. And yet, no one was there for her. She continued working at the bar, and since she had no one to babysit me, I became her shadow. The only ones who occasionally helped were her co-workers. But at the end of the night, when the bar shut its doors and the city fell into silence, she was alone again. One particular night, she returned home exhausted, her arms aching from carrying trays and scrubbing counters, her feet throbbing from endless hours of standing. I was just a baby, swaddled in a thin blanket, oblivious to the weight of the world crushing her. She placed me in my crib, a flimsy, second-hand thing that wobbled at the slightest touch, then dragged herself to the shower. The warm water was a small mercy, washing away the filth of the night but not the exhaustion. Afterward, she collapsed onto her bed, hoping for a few hours of sleep before the nightmare of survival began again. Our house was nothing special. 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, a living room with sagging furniture, and a porch that creaked whenever the wind blew. The neighborhood was decent enough, the kind of place where people minded their own business. But there were rumors. Stories whispered in hushed voices about a shadow lurking in the dark, a man who stole newborns from their cribs. Some claimed he collected them. Others said he sold them to the highest bidder. But most dismissed it as urban legend, just another ghost story. They were wrong. At around 9 p.m., my mother jolted awake. A noise echoed from the porch, sharp and unexpected. She stiffened, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind our house, thick bushes stretched into the night, home to raccoons and other creatures that scavenged through trash. That had to be it. Just an animal. She exhaled, shaking off the paranoia, and let her body sink back into the mattress. Then came another sound. This time, from the back of the house. Near my window. Her breath caught in her throat. Still, she reasoned with herself. Maybe the wind. Maybe another raccoon. But a part of her, the part that had learned to survive in a world that never showed kindness, whispered otherwise. She threw off the covers and moved to the living room, switching on the backyard lights. A blinding glow flooded the night. Silence followed. Whatever had been there was gone, or hiding. She stood motionless, listening. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Slowly, she exhaled and returned to bed, her muscles still coiled tight. Just as she began to drift off, the house was swallowed by darkness. The lamps, the hallway light, everything. Gone. Panic surged through her. She always kept the lamps on at night so she could see me if I cried. But this was not a normal outage. The electricity was prepaid, paid in full. The power should not have gone out. She crept to the window, peering outside. The street was still lit. Other houses glowed in the night. Only ours had been plunged into the abyss. Then she heard it. A faint scuffling outside my window. Boots. Heavy, deliberate footsteps pressed into the dirt. Her blood ran cold. She had to get to me. Blind in the darkness, she moved carefully, guiding herself along the walls until she reached the kitchen. A flashlight was kept in a cabinet for emergencies. She fumbled for it, her fingers trembling. Then, through the stillness, another sound reached her. Not footsteps. Metal. Something scraping against my window. She turned toward my room, her pulse thundering in her ears. A figure stood just beyond the glass. Tall. Dressed in black. Gloves covering his hands. A mask concealing his face, its surface painted into a grotesque, frozen grin. Beside him, a shopping cart. The darkness made details hard to decipher, but she could see enough. He was trying to be quiet, careful. But he was growing impatient. He wedged a crowbar beneath the window, trying to pry it open. My mother held her breath. Fear roared inside her, screaming for her to run, to hide. But she did neither. She reached my crib. Lightly, she placed a hand on my tiny chest, feeling the slow rise and fall. I was still there. Still breathing. She scooped me into her arms and turned back to the window. The man was still there, oblivious to her presence. His gloved hands trembled with frustration as he jammed the crowbar harder, trying to force his way in. Then, a snap. A sliver of glass fractured beneath his weight. His hand reached through the broken pane, his fingers fumbling for the latch. My mother moved without thinking. She placed me on the couch and sprinted to the kitchen, her mind a whirlwind of terror and rage. A knife. She needed a knife. She yanked open a drawer, grabbed the largest one she could find, and rushed back to my room. The man had managed to reach further inside. The latch rattled under his touch, ready to give way. She did not hesitate. With every ounce of strength she possessed, she drove the blade into his hand. A guttural scream tore through the night as the blade sank deep. The masked intruder jerked back violently, wrenching his injured hand from the window. Blood splattered across the glass, dark and glistening in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the curtains. But my mother was not done. She did not cower. She did not retreat. She grabbed a heavy wooden chair from the corner of the room and, with all her might, swung it at the window. The remaining shards of glass exploded outward, forcing the man to stumble backward with a strangled curse. He locked eyes with her then, or at least, she thought he did. The mask concealed his features, but she could feel his rage, his disbelief. This was not how his night was supposed to go. He had expected an easy target. A defenseless woman. A helpless child. Instead, he had found a mother willing to spill his blood to protect what was hers. The street was still eerily silent. The neighbors had yet to stir, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in their midst. But my mother knew she could not count on them. If she wanted to end this, she would have to do it alone. The man hesitated for only a moment before reaching into his coat. My mother's breath caught in her throat. A gun? A knife? She did not wait to find out. In a blur of movement, she snatched up a ceramic vase from the bedside table and hurled it through the broken window. It shattered against his shoulder, knocking him off balance. He let out another furious growl before making a decision. He turned and bolted, disappearing into the darkness, his boots pounding against the earth as he fled. My mother did not chase him. She did not need to. She knew she had done enough to send him running. But she also knew this was not over. She sprinted back to the living room and grabbed me from the couch, holding me so tightly I almost stopped breathing. Her hands trembled, her heart thundered against her ribs, but she forced herself to move. She ran to the front door, yanked it open, and rushed to the nearest house, the home of an elderly couple who had always been kind to her. She banged on their door with the strength of a desperate woman. When it finally swung open, she stumbled inside without explanation, cradling me against her chest as she gasped for breath. The police arrived within minutes, summoned by the couple who had called as soon as they saw my mother's terror-stricken face. She recounted everything, her voice raw, her hands still sticky with the stranger's blood. The officers took the knife as evidence, examined the shattered window, and followed the trail of blood leading away from our home. It guided them deep into the woods. And there, beneath the twisted embrace of gnarled trees, they found something far worse than they had imagined. An abandoned house, its walls coated in grime, its windows boarded shut. The officers forced their way inside, expecting to find nothing more than an empty ruin. Instead, they found cribs. Dozens of them. 30 small beds lined the walls, each one occupied. The children, all newborns, lay swaddled in rags, their tiny faces pale and expressionless. Malnourished. Drugged. Stolen from families who had long since given up hope of ever seeing them again. The air inside was heavy with the scent of decay and desperation. There were no caretakers, no signs of who had been tending to the babies. Only silence, and the eerie knowledge that this place had been used for something monstrous. As the officers searched further, they found tire tracks leading away from the property, fresh enough to suggest that someone had fled just before their arrival. The man who had broken into our home had not been working alone. And now, he was gone. The investigation stretched on for months, but no suspect was ever caught. The blood on the knife led to nothing. The house in the woods was linked to no one. The children, miraculously, were returned to their families, but the horror of what had nearly happened to me never faded from my mother's mind. She had nearly lost me that night. I had nearly become another nameless infant, stolen from my crib, swallowed by the darkness. But she did not let that happen. She fought. And she won. So tell me, how do you measure the bravery of a mother who is willing to spill blood to protect her child? The blade sank deep into the man's flesh, cutting through muscle and tendon. A guttural scream ripped through the night as he yanked his hand back, blood splattering against the broken glass. He stumbled backward, his masked face jerking toward the wound as though he could will it to stop bleeding. My mother did not wait. With her heart hammering in her chest, she scooped me back into her arms and bolted toward the front door. Her fingers fumbled at the lock, slick with sweat, as she threw it open and raced outside. The cold night air burned her lungs as she sprinted toward the nearest house, her bare feet slamming against the pavement. Behind her, the man roared in fury. She could hear the crunch of his boots against gravel, the sound of his breath ragged with rage and pain. But he did not follow. He could not afford to. Lights flickered on in the neighboring houses as the commotion stirred the sleeping street. Doors creaked open, wary voices calling into the night. A neighbor, a stout woman in a nightgown, stepped onto her porch, eyes wide with confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Call the police," my mother gasped, tightening her hold on me. "There's a man, he tried to take my baby." The woman did not hesitate. She disappeared inside, and within moments, the wail of sirens shattered the quiet. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. Blood trailed from my window to the edge of the forest, where the tracks vanished into the undergrowth. Officers searched the area, but he had melted into the shadows, slipping away like a phantom. Inside our home, the authorities examined the shattered window, the crowbar still lying on the ground, and the blood-stained knife clutched in my mother's trembling hands. They took statements, combed the area for clues, and reassured her that they would do everything they could to find him. But my mother knew better. She knew evil did not simply disappear. It lingered, waiting, watching. That night, we did not return home. A kind-hearted officer drove us to a motel, offering a temporary refuge while they investigated. But sleep did not come easily. My mother lay awake, gripping the knife beneath the motel sheets, listening to every creak and rustle outside our door. In the following days, the police discovered something far more disturbing. Deep within the forest, hidden beneath a canopy of twisted branches, they uncovered an abandoned house. Inside, they found cribs, dozens of them. Rusted, empty cribs lined up in rows, their paint peeling like the remnants of a forgotten nightmare. But some of the cribs were not empty. 30 infants were found inside, their cries echoing against the decaying walls. They were weak, malnourished, but alive. The authorities worked tirelessly to reunite them with their families, each child a testament to the horror that had been unfolding in the shadows for far too long. The man, however, was never caught. His face remained an enigma, hidden behind that grotesque mask. The police followed every lead, traced every drop of blood, but he had vanished. No fingerprints, no identity, nothing. Just a ghost in the night, a nightmare left unfinished. For my mother, the terror never truly ended. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the streetlights outside, every gust of wind rattling the windows brought back that night. She never trusted the darkness again. And neither do I. The knife sank deep into the intruder's flesh, and a guttural scream tore through the night. He stumbled back, yanking his wounded hand to his chest as dark blood dripped onto the ground. My mother did not wait to see his reaction. She grabbed me from the couch and sprinted to the front door, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. The neighborhood had been quiet, peaceful. But now, porch lights flicked on, and voices murmured in alarm. Her screams had shattered the night, waking those who would have otherwise ignored the dangers lurking in the shadows. A neighbor, an older man who always drank his beer on the front steps, stepped outside, squinting into the darkness. When he saw my mother clutching me tightly, terror plastered across her face, he knew something was wrong. The old man did not hesitate. He called the police while others emerged from their homes, drawn by the disturbance. My mother barely registered any of it. She kept looking over her shoulder, expecting to see the masked man charging after her, determined to finish what he started. But he was gone. The only trace of him was the smear of blood on my bedroom window. When the police arrived, she told them everything, her voice trembling with the aftershock of terror. Officers swept the yard, the bushes, the alley behind the house. They followed the blood trail, leading them deeper into the darkened streets. And then, they found something that turned their stomachs. An abandoned shack, hidden at the edge of the forest, its wooden walls covered in years of rot. Inside, cribs lined the floor, 30 in total. Some were empty, their blankets rumpled as if a baby had been hastily removed. Others held infants, small, frail, stolen from their families. The police worked quickly, rescuing the children, calling for backup, documenting the scene. But the man, the monster who had taken them, was nowhere to be found. Despite the evidence, despite the blood my mother had spilled in self-defense, he disappeared into the night. He was never caught. The story made the news, whispered between horrified mothers and concerned fathers. It became a warning, a tale of caution shared in hushed voices. Some called my mother a hero. Others simply shook their heads, grateful that their children were safe. As for my mother, she never slept peacefully again. Every shadow, every creak of the house, reminded her of that night. She never let me out of her sight, never let her guard down. And as I grew older, she told me the truth, not just for me to know, but for me to understand. The world is filled with monsters. Some hide in the dark, lurking behind windows, waiting to steal innocence. But others, like my mother, are the kind that fight back. And that is why she will always be my warrior.